Hi, I'm Dr. Howard Zucker, the doc in Docology. Once upon a time, not that long ago, just having marijuana in your pocket could land you in serious legal trouble. But then fast forward to today, and cannabis, marijuana, is now legal in about half the states across the country. And that shift has been dramatic. And with that change, the presence of marijuana in our everyday lives has become much more visible and in many ways, actually much more smellable. Because if you've walked down a city street lately, the chances are that you've caught a whiff of it in the air. And for many of us, that's pretty much a passing annoyance or a nuisance, but it raises a deeper, more serious question, which is what happens to young children who are regularly exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke. And sometimes it's not just in the street, it's actually in their own homes. So today on our podcast, I am thrilled to be joined by someone who has been on the front lines of this kind of research. Dr. Karen Wilson is a pediatrician at the University of Rochester Medical Center in New York, and she serves as the co-director of their Clinical and Translational Science Institute. And for over 20 years, she has been focused on pediatric research, specifically looking at the effects of secondhand smoke, whether it comes from tobacco or cannabis. And her work has helped since then shine a light on how often children, even hospitalized children, infants and toddlers, are involuntarily exposed to marijuana or cannabis in the environments that they are in the hospital or elsewhere. It is powerful, it is important research that has real implications for public health, for parenting, and for policy. So, Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for joining us today. It is truly a pleasure to have you join us. I thought maybe I could start with a simple question of what led you into this particular area of research? Because it wasn't exactly something that was on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. I mean, was there a moment or an experience or something that sparked you to decide, I'm going to look at the secondhand smoke effects on children?
So thank you so much, Dr. Zucker, for having me on this podcast today, for for shining a little bit of light onto this topic. And I'm happy to answer that question. So I was actually working at the Children's Hospital of Colorado in Colorado when marijuana was legalized. And I had had a fairly long-standing interest in the impact of secondhand tobacco smoke exposure. And we were doing research studies looking at how secondhand smoke exposure impacted children who were hospitalized with bronchiolitis. And as we were recruiting the families, we kept hearing, oh, I don't smoke tobacco anymore. I only smoke marijuana because it's natural. And the more I heard this, the more I was struck by the fact that, we'd been working so hard on secondhand tobacco smoke, but secondhand marijuana smoke was going to sneak in and start to impact children. We've known for a long time that secondhand tobacco smoke is dangerous. It's dangerous because it has particulates. It's dangerous because it has nicotine, and it has other chemicals. So there's lots of reasons for it to be dangerous. And the question is marijuana smoke as dangerous? And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But that was really the start, was hearing that answer.
Very interesting. I remember as an anesthesiologist, one of my colleagues, Eric Skolnick, this is in New York, actually was looking at the effects of secondhand smoke on kids who go in for surgery and what happens to them under anesthesia and their respiratory issues. So, and that was in the 1990s, but clearly now with marijuana, it's another issue. What you were mentioning a little bit about the chemicals that are in it. What are these dangerous chemicals that are in the marijuana, and what are their long-term effects? I mean, there's a lot that we know about tobacco, but what's in marijuana?
So if you think about marijuana when it's being combusted, and I'm not talking right now about vaping marijuana, and we can get into that a little bit, much less clarity on that. Certainly not edibles, which, obviously, unless your children are eating them, are quite less dangerous than that smoke. Anytime you have a combusted plant product, you create particulate matter and you create chemicals like polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And then you also have for marijuana, you have the specific components of the marijuana leaf, particularly THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive component, the one that makes you high in marijuana. And then you have the cannabidiols, so the CBD, the CBN. I'm going to forget all of my cannabinoids, but those also they can attach to the cannabinoid receptors in the brain, and so we think that those are probably the components that are most helpful from a therapeutic context. So, balancing out the dangers of marijuana smoke exposure are the potential benefits of it for children getting cancer, who have cancer and are getting chemotherapy. So, if you look at the Charlotte's Web, so the marijuana plant that was developed for the girl with the seizures in Colorado, had very low THC and very high CBD. So you've got both of these chemicals that we can actually measure in children who are exposed to secondhand smoke. So you've got actually in some of the studies, they've showed about 2.5 times to more of the levels of the 2.5 particulate matter. So the particulates, so it's the PM 2.5s, which are these sizes of particles that tend to get into the lungs. You actually get more of that with a marijuana cigarette. And then you have all of the chemicals that are associated with burning plant things, including for marijuana, benzopyrenes, which are carcinogenic. And then you have the THC and the CBDs.
So are these short-term and long-term effects of this smoke, of these chemicals? What happens in the short term? Because you mentioned a little bit about the brain, and these kids are clearly, their brains are developing, and what effect is going to have on them in the developing brain in the short term, and then in the long term, years down the road?
This is a really, really important question that we really don't know the answer to. So to date, we do not have any long-term prospective studies that have followed children who have been exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke after birth. We do know from a number of very well-done studies, like the ABCD study, that exposure prenatally is associated with negative mental health outcomes, negative neurodevelopmental outcomes as children get older. It's also associated with other negative outcomes, but we can measure THC in the brains of young children, which would indicate, in my mind, that there is likely to be some kind of an impact from this. We just don't know because we haven't done the studies.
So in many ways, you're saying this baby, this in utero, is like many of the other dangers they're exposed to. They're just trapped and exposed to this constant, marijuana from a mom who's smoking it at the time during her pregnancy, and we don't know what's going to happen.
Well, with those, actually, sorry, but we do. So the ones who are exposed before birth, we do have good evidence that that's not helpful for the child later on. There are some inconsistencies in some of the studies, but I think most people would argue that it's better not to smoke marijuana during pregnancy.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's separating out. So if you're exposed during pregnancy, how likely are you also to be exposed after pregnancy? And so it's really hard to find a child who wasn't exposed before they were born and then was exposed after they were born, and then following them to see what kind of impact that will have. So that's why it's been so hard to get funding to be able to study this topic.
I get your point. Is basically if the mom was smoking the marijuana in utero, then baby's born. What's going to suddenly stop unless she feels like, oh, now the baby's there in my environment, I'm not going to do it. But it's hard for people who start something to suddenly change their behavior. What are the risks? When you say the risks to the unborn, is this that their cognitive development is impaired? Is it that they are at risk for respiratory problems? Is it a risk? What's the risk to them as they grow?
Most of the studies that have been done have really focused on the neurodevelopmental outcomes. So things like, and they've been a little bit all over the map. And just for this podcast, reviewing some of the meta-analyses, there's tons of studies that look at tons of different really focused areas of neurodevelopment. And in general, what they're finding is that neurodevelopment is impacted. The question is how much, and it's going to depend a lot on exposure, the exposure level, the number of years of exposure, even just things like how potent the marijuana was that was being smoked around them. So I don't know that we have a really firm answer on exactly what that impact is going to be.
So now the baby, so let's say the baby's affected in utero, and then the baby's now born. Now they're basically exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke. Are there carcinogens in that secondhand marijuana smoke that they're now exposed to while they're infant, toddler, child?
Yes, so as I mentioned, we know at least polyaromatic hydrocarbons and benzopyrene are both present in marijuana smoke exposure. I believe there are other potential carcinogens. Interestingly, secondhand or active marijuana smoking has less of a link to cancer than active tobacco smoking does. So that tobacco smoking is very clearly carcinogenic, and I don't believe that like NNK, which is a tobacco-specific nitrosamine, that I know is a carcinogen. And so that may impact why tobacco smoke is more dangerous. That doesn't mean that marijuana is not dangerous, but it just means that it doesn't have the same impact as tobacco.
Is that something that we know for sure, or that more research may change that and start to say that there is a risk of cancer from marijuana?
These days, I will never say that it's that if we do more research, it won't show something different, because I've seen enough cases where I've been like, I'm pretty sure that no one's going to find that tobacco smoking is healthy for the lungs. We'll just we'll go with that.
Yeah, I hear you on that. So CDC says that it mentions that there's causes of marijuana, secondhand marijuana can cause attention problems and memory problems in adolescents. Maybe you share a little bit your thoughts about that, because, and then we'll get back to the kids, the younger kids in a second.
Yeah, was that active use or was it secondhand exposure?
Secondhand exposed to the smoke. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and that makes sense because, they have the same receptors, and we see that in active smoking in adolescents also, attention, problems with attention. And I think we haven't really looked to see what's causing that. Is it that they're actually getting a little high? Is it that the THC is binding onto the receptors? Is it the CBD that's making them just feel a little bit more calm? Not sure.
So that brings you raised the question of getting a little high. How much secondhand marijuana smoke would it take for like a little kid to get high, who's just exposed in the house? And what would that actually look like if this kid got enough marijuana?
I mean, we have plenty, unfortunately, of cases of small children who I've taken care of in the hospital who have ingested marijuana and come in clearly high. We did have one case where we had somebody come in that was only exposed to secondhand marijuana smoke and was acting high. And so, I believe that child probably had the other doctor, the toxicologist, was trying to tell me that the child had just actually eaten some of it, but the parents denied it. And I'm like, no, you can get, we've seen levels in the studies that I've done that would get you arrested for impaired driving if you were an adult, right? So I think one of the struggles with marijuana in general, in terms of measuring it and measuring impairment, is that you can have a wide variety of experiences with the same blood level. So particularly for somebody who's using it every day, you can have a higher level and still not be acting impaired. And we have absolutely no idea what that pharmacokinetics looks like for kids.
Tell us a story about some of the patients that you've seen. I mean, you must have some amazing stories of a kid who you would never expect to have had a problem and is high from marijuana. I'd just be curious to hear, like, what have you seen on a very clinical level?
So generally speaking, they act just kind of high. They're usually very small. They're usually like 2. They can't walk straight. They're lethargic. They're not communicating with you. It's kind of sad. And aside from that one case, I don't think that we rarely would see that from secondhand exposure. Usually it's from ingesting a gummy or something like that. So if you have any marijuana around, that's an important thing, is to lock up your gummies.
Be sure the kid doesn't get exposed to it. Someone told me a story about their animal who ate the gummies because they smell it and they grab it and they eat it. So
they're really, they look really tasty.
They're best to keep it away from them. You talk a little bit about your research. You've done some amazing research on surfaces and what you have found in hospitals. So I was reading about it. I'm just fascinated. Maybe you could share a little bit about Why is well, tell us a little bit about it, and then I'll have
Well,
some.
so the project in the hospital that we're looking at surfaces is ongoing. So we haven't analyzed that data yet. But we did do some surveys of our staff. And about 95% of our staff have smelled marijuana smoke in one of our intensive care units in the previous month. And I think most of them are experiencing this on a daily to a weekly basis.
The newborn intensive care unit, where the
Yes.
so these neonates, these little babies, basically premature babies, are the whiff of
Yep.
marijuana is there.
And it's around now. We don't know how much is actually getting to the baby. That's part of what we're going to be looking at. And so we want to be careful. We don't want to, these are families that are under an extreme amount of stress. And we can't say for sure that it's always the families. Could we have some staff who are also using off when they're not at work and they're bringing it in their clothes? I mean, that's certainly, I hope not, but I don't want to put everything onto the families because I want to be very cautious about that. But if there's ways that we can help families that are under a whole lot of stress manage it in a different way than needing to use marijuana, or using marijuana in a form that's not going to bring that smoke in, I think that's a better option.
So it's the surface so basically you were testing the surfaces of these neonatal intensive care units and finding marijuana there. And you're saying it could be from the families, could be from others, staff, or whoever who were there. And I guess they're not wearing gloves. The staff may be wearing gloves, but other people may not. So, and it could be it may be just from gummies, other things that are on their fingers, I guess.
Yeah. And the study that was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I was just curious. Yeah.
Yeah. So the study that we're kind of replicating, which was done in Texas, was with tobacco smoke exposure. And so they were looking at nicotine on surfaces in the NICU. And they also looked at nicotine on the fingers of the parents. So in our study, we're not going to actually see or talk to any parents because we wanted to be very careful about confidentiality around this type of exposure because it's a very sensitive issue. But we are going to be able to test the surfaces and see if there's THC.
So more research needs to be done, clearly. Are there challenges right now of getting the funding for this research? I mean, there's so many issues, both at NIH, CDC, just in government in general.
Yeah.
Has that impacted the funding that you and others need to study this issue, which is so important?
I would say yes, in the sense that all funding has been negatively impacted and slowed down, and just the whole the federal situation has been a challenge writ large. I think one of the biggest challenges that we've had with marijuana smoke exposure is that the way our system is set up, no one institute sort of owns it. Or we're starting to get a little bit more from NIDA, the National Institute for Drug Abuse, in terms of their interest in looking at this as an issue. But once you start to bring in the respiratory complications and you're saying, we want to look at the impact over time for children that are exposed, we want to look at neurodevelopment, and we want to look at their respiratory health because we have one cohort. And they're like, well, no, that's National Institute for Heart and Lung Development, NHLBI, the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute.
NHLBI, right.
Yeah. So they're like, it's somebody else's issue.
And then someone may say the surfaces are occupational safety and health, NIOSH.
Right. Or NIEHS, right? Environmental Health Sciences.
Right. So we don't know. But if the goal is to make America healthy again, then we should fund all of this in an effort to make America healthy again. And little kids are surely the beginning of making America healthy again. What about, so let's say it's in the air. So you have marijuana in the air and it's one thing on the street, but now you're living in a house or an apartment and you have a neighbor who's smoking marijuana. This now becomes an environmental issue. Are there policies that are in place that will protect people that you've heard about? Because there are policies in place regarding tobacco, and surely like in restaurants and places like that. What policies are in place and what do you think should be done to protect people?
Yeah, so this is a real challenge, and it was a big issue when I was in New York City at Mount Sinai. We relatively frequently had families that were coming in and saying, we have smoke coming from another apartment. And I had some interesting discussions with the city housing authority and health department about this as well, because it's on their radar. And they have you can actually they can give you a log of all of the calls that they've gotten, which has been a pretty significant number. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of, it is it's obviously illegal federally, still. So it is not legal to smoke marijuana in federally funded HUD housing, just like it's now not legal to smoke tobacco in either. Um, in the studies that we've done on reported incursions in New York City, it was pretty common in federally funded housing to smell marijuana smoke. And so if it's not being enforced, I think that's the first place to start, is that we need to be able to enforce it. And there are monitors that you can put into apartments that will, I know they have some for nicotine, but I believe they also have some for marijuana smoke as well now.
So maybe people end up with, just like we have a smoke detector, something sitting up on your ceiling to look for this. So you were saying a lot of phone calls, these phone calls that are coming and saying, my neighbor's smoking marijuana, it's affecting me, what to do. Because I will tell you, I was talking to someone the other day when I was dropping my kids off for to the bus for camp, and she was telling me that she was struggling with this issue with a neighbor, and it was very difficult. Even talking to the landlord, it was very difficult to change that until the person ultimately moved out. But she had little kids, so.
Yep. No, and I think that's a real, it's been a real challenge, and I think it's a place where policymakers really need to step up and start to enforce these policies.
And
Especially, yeah.
Sorry, no, go ahead. No.
Especially when there are children involved.
Right. And so that goes to the EPA issue, because this is an environmental issue. So I looked on their website, and because I was wondering about air purifiers, do they help? And the EPA website says ventilation, filtration, and air cleaning techniques can reduce harmful substances released from marijuana use in indoors, but are not likely to eliminate them. And they actually put in bold can, and they put in bold are not likely to eliminate them. So I'm wondering, what do you think about how do we get rid of this for the person who's living in a house with marijuana smoke coming through the vents?
Yeah, obviously it's going to be, if the smoking is happening in your home, then you just need to stop it from happening there. If it's coming in from another apartment, that's where mitigation, talk to your landlord about moving apartments. I believe, I might be wrong on this. There's the Department of Housing and Urban Development has a website with a toolkit for residents who are being exposed to secondhand tobacco smoke. And it's all very relevant to secondhand marijuana smoke as well. And probably more so given that it's still illegal federally. Certainly finding ways with your landlord to block off any vents that are between you and the apartment where the marijuana is coming from. I think if a purifier is probably, the research that I've seen, particularly on tobacco smoke, is that purifiers can help reduce it a little bit less, but it doesn't actually improve health outcomes. But it's certainly something that would be worth trying if you're in a place where you can't actually leave.
Go ahead.
No,
go ahead. So I was just going to say that we mentioned before about the different NIH institutes, but now on this issue, it's almost HHS, Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Housing and Urban Development Department, and maybe the Department of Justice. So now you're dealing with four major parts of the United States government that need to work together to address a problem that affects children in their home.
All of which have had 10 to 20% staffing cuts in the past 6 months.
That goes back to the issues like, how do you move some of these things forward to make America healthy again if you're going to have less people there to do the work that needs to get done? So that is a huge issue, and that's a policy issue and a political issue, but really a big issue, particularly for the children that we have out there. So how could we reduce the exposure, this secondhand smoke exposure, not just in the home, but just in general, for the public? Are there certain things you think we could do to protect kids and adults?
I think the availability of the ingested marijuana products is pretty outstanding. I mean, they're available everywhere. They're quite tasty. There's drinks. There's ways for people to use marijuana without having to smoke it, and that also reduces the combusted impact on the smoker's lungs as well. So obviously, we don't know the long-term implications of especially the high potency THC that we have now on the adult brain, and we do have some very significant concerns. Let me be clear. I don't think I've talked about this yet, but teenagers, adolescents should not be using any kind of marijuana product at all, because their brains are developing and their internal endocannabinoid systems are developing. And that exposure is going to be much more dangerous from a long-term developmental standpoint than if they waited until they were 25.
So you say teenagers, but not only the kids, but you're saying teenagers also. These 17-year-old kids should not be using any of this. Their brain is still developing, so you're saying that's the danger. These receptors in their brains are just are being laid down. But has anyone ever looked at MRIs or scans? Is there anything that we can look at visually that we can show a kid or an adolescent or anyone saying this is what can happen? Because sometimes people need to see it
Yeah.
in front of them.
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't work as much in the adolescent use space as in the younger kids' secondhand exposure, although I'd love to look at MRIs of younger children with secondhand exposure. But I don't know. It's a really good question. I could look that up and send you the information.
Yeah, that would be great. I just because everyone's into imaging, and now we have all this artificial intelligence issue. So maybe if you had a lot of data and a lot of information, you could look and say, here's what happens from the use of marijuana, short-term, long-term, secondhand exposure, chronic use, and it would be, important information, I guess, looking down the road. We've addressed also tobacco, alcohol, illicit drugs, and how do we address marijuana to get this message out? And what do we tell kids about this so that they don't think, oh, well, this is sort of cool and I'll just do it, so that they don't end up going down that path?
That's such a great question. And I think it's incumbent on the parents to really, first of all, model good behavior. And, if you are a marijuana user, don't use it with your children, particularly. Don't use it around your children. Make sure that you're changing your clothes afterwards, ingest if you can. And please be careful about being impaired. So one of the things that we worry about with marijuana smoke exposure that we don't with tobacco smoke is that not only are the parents exposing them to that secondhand smoke, but they also may be impaired if they're using it more recreationally and at a higher level than just sort of mood management, which I think is a lot of what happens. So modeling good behavior, telling your teens about the dangers of it, and monitoring what they're doing, watching to see whether they're withdrawing at all or whether they're having trouble in school. Who are their friends and what are their friends doing? It's a great question for parents to ask is, what are your friends using? Because kids will admit things that their friends are using and that they won't admit that they're using.
Yeah, on all things, whether it's cell phones, cigarettes, the alcohol, right? So it's a great question. Sometimes they may be onto us as adults, but by and large, it's good to say, well, what are your friends doing? Then that brings up a big issue that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes, as I was preparing for this, is driving under the influence of marijuana, because kids using marijuana, we know what driving under the influence of alcohol is, and we do have blood alcohol levels, right? 0.05, 0.08, somewhere in that range, depending on the state. It's considered legally impaired. So are there ways to do a dose response curve to figure out what dose of marijuana ends up putting you basically impaired, or is it any dose makes you impaired?
So it's a great question. I'm not an expert at this, but I know a little bit. So there are cutoffs. I know when I was in Colorado, they put a firm cutoff in terms of what a urine THC would need to be for you to be called impaired. And that was fought in court by somebody who was a chronic user of marijuana for a medical condition, and said that they, at that level, they were not impaired. And so I think I alluded to this earlier, where marijuana is a little bit different than alcohol in that, there's a pretty significant variability in what your levels are and how impaired you are, depending on how much you're already using it. It also has a very long half-life. The half-life of nicotine is like 18 hours, or cocaine is like 18 hours. So for marijuana, it's more like 3 to 5 days. And so you accumulate, and it's also fat soluble. So you accumulate more THC in your system, which may not be impacting your brain anymore, but is still in your body. So I think, it's a very confusing pharmacological question. I just talked to a pharmacist who's really interested in marijuana, so I can actually ask him that question and see if he's got a better answer.
I'd like to hear that one too. We're going to have to follow off on a whole bunch of topics here. If marijuana is legal for adults at 21, is that age based on the brain science, the public health data, or on policy? What set that age?
4 out of 5 adolescent medicine doctors would advise not using any of these substances until 25. we sort of, I'm not an adolescent medicine doctor, but I talk to them a lot. And your brain really, and my husband would argue that he's not fully myelinated, but you're really not fully myelinated until you're 25 at least. And so, and that your brain development, anything used before that gives you an increased risk of becoming addicted or having negative side effects from it.
And brain myelination, just for the public, just basically means that your brain is it's done, it's developed, and no more processing or laying down the railroad tracks to speak.
Most of them,
Yeah, most of it's done. That's true. Um, Another question. Back to the Colorado issue. Have you spoken to your colleagues in Colorado? Because that was, the forefront. Are they, so they're a little further down the road. Are they saying, oh, I wish we had done X or I wish we had done Y now that we've seen more people using this?
Yeah, I think there is a sense that they wish there had been more regulations around the exposure of children. So, and I actually, when I first, after we learned that it had passed, but before it was actually implemented, I sat down with the executive director of the Department of Public Health of Colorado. And I said, listen, I do research in secondhand tobacco smoke exposure. You really need to be thinking about the secondhand exposure of children. Completely ignored me. And in fact, made it illegal to smoke in public, smoke marijuana in public places. So the only place you could smoke it if you had an apartment was inside your home, unless you had a yard. And so I think that they've eased up on that a little bit. They've created places where people can go to smoke marijuana, more sort of private parks and places where people can do that. But I think that was a big missed opportunity.
Okay. And are we seeing, so that's Colorado. Are we seeing similar things in other states where they're saying maybe we should have approached the laws a little bit differently, or are they just not there yet?
I don't know that people are really there yet. I mean, I think the problem is that there's not a lot of concrete evidence that it's harmful. And so that allows people to live with the justification that it's not harmful, which I think is really dangerous. And that's what we did with tobacco for many years. And obviously we know that that's not the case.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and I also think that, especially now, there's a lot of health issues at the forefront, things like measles, and obesity and other things that are taking up a lot of the airspace, where tobacco smoke exposure maybe 20 years ago was getting a little bit more attention.
Do you think we'll ever have a device? Because I know some companies are working on this, a device where, when it comes to driving, back to the driving question, where someone is able to, sort of a police officer, say, okay, I can test you in 2 seconds and know that you have been exposed to marijuana, versus sampling the saliva, which may be require a lab test or something of that nature?
I mean, I think the question is going to be, would it be able to quantify it, and would it be able to identify impairment? And both of those, I think, will be a challenge. Although, I mean, we've got the whole tricorder thing, right? Eventually we're going to have all of the technology. I think that's a ways off.
And so we have to see where we go with that, and maybe it'll be there, and maybe the police officers will get involved in it, and maybe it'll be again more research, because I'm sure with cigarette smoke it was the same. With alcohol, is the same at some point, that people probably say, okay, what's the level, what's the impairment, years ago, and now we just take it for granted. Yeah. What about the rise of the number of cases of fentanyl laced marijuana? Because it seems like fentanyl is getting into a lot of different areas, and the dangers, as as an anesthesiologist, just in general, anyone knows this, is that the dangers are so high when it comes to fentanyl, causing severe respiratory failure to people, respiratory depression. Have you seen that, or have you heard about that?
Yes, I've definitely seen and heard about that, and it's a big concern, especially. Oh, yeah. So talking about the adolescent question again, an adult, a 21-year-old, can go into a dispensary and get a very highly controlled dose of marijuana, a bunch of leaf marijuana to be able to smoke. A teenager can't go in there with good reason, but so they are more likely to be on the streets and taking the marijuana that's off the streets, and that is the more likely possibility to be affected by fentanyl. So it's definitely a danger, and something also to warn teenagers about.
So it requires all of us working together to address this. And then it goes back to what you said before about parents asking questions. Who are your friends? Who are they hanging out with?
Yeah.
And someone says, "Oh, my friend got this marijuana on the street, but I don't do it." And
Yeah.
you
You
know,
can really be like,
yeah,
oh, do
yeah,
not,
antennas need to go up on
yeah.
that one. Three, before we go to the questions from our audience, three takeaways. Are there three things you think we should all remember about this so that when people think about these issues, say, okay, these are the three things our expert told us?
Sure. So I think the first one is that um, when children are exposed to marijuana smoke, they get THC and CBD, two psychoactive components, or THC is two bioactive components in their bodies. So we know that they are being exposed to the chemicals that make adults high. We don't know what the impact of that exposure is, but we haven't demonstrated that it's safe, and we have a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that is likely not safe. So it's really important for families that either use marijuana or living in places where their child can be exposed to marijuana smoke on a regular basis to figure out how to limit that, preferably to
Okay. So any other key things you think?
none. Oh, did you pull anything else out? I was like, those are the ones I really want people. Oh, and
Yeah,
adolescents should
yeah.
absolutely not be using marijuana
Okay,
or
that's very
alcohol or tobacco.
right. Or any drug, any illicit drugs. I know they
Anyway,
probably right, and it's unfortunate because that's the age where they're all trying to become themselves or
right.
create their own identity. And unfortunately, a lot of these chemicals and substances
Yeah,
sort of play into that. And you need to sort of just say, don't do this. But it goes back to modeling, is what you were
yeah,
saying, in many ways. So,
yeah.
and hopefully your research and what you're doing will put this out there and people will recognize, okay, the studies have shown this. And the more that information is out there,
Yeah.
the better it is for the public.
And if anyone knows RFK
Yeah.
Jr. and you can get him to
Uh,
fund this research,
I
go my way.
I would like to get him on this podcast and talk about that issue and probably 30 other issues. And I think when you bring up this issue about funding, we need to fund this. And whether it's the National Institutes of Health and their um, different institutes there, or the CDC, or any of the EPA. I mean, we went through a whole list of different areas. We need to fund this because that's the only way you make a country people healthier. And so I am all for the research. I'm all for the funding. I'm all for doing what we need to get the
Thank
information.
you.
Completely against cutting any of this funding on these issues. So we're going to turn to our audience for questions. I always say at this point, just if you have questions about your own medical concerns, always check with your doctor. The podcast is for informational purposes, and your doctor knows your medical history, so check with them. But let's turn to the audience and see what questions we have out there today.
Funny enough, you asked a few of the questions from the
Oh,
subscribers today,
okay.
but I did have a question and then sort of a follow-up just on something that you were talking about. And then if there's other questions that come up, I will bring folks up. But I'm curious what age you think is the best to start having conversations with your kids about cannabis. They may not be exposed at 3, but like, how do you have that conversation with a 3-year-old? But that would definitely be different than a conversation you would have with like an 8 to 10-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's the first part of my question.
Yeah, so I think it's going to depend on the age and the context, right? Like, so if you're in a place where there's a lot of people who are walking down the street smoking it and they're noticing the smell when they walk by them or in the park or something like that, you can have a conversation and say they're smoking something that's dangerous to their lungs, and could be dangerous to their brains. And so, we'll talk more about it as you get older, but just like smoking cigarettes, this is something that we don't do in our family. And then as they get older, I think, especially around depending on their social circles, as you start to ask them those questions about what their friends are doing, some of these kids are being exposed to especially vape pens at very young ages. And so starting to just explore a little bit, you don't have to come out and say, oh, are you vaping or anything like that? But, oh, it's interesting. What are people using? What are people doing in the bathrooms in your school? And what are people, what are your friends talking about? And you'll get a sense of whether you need to start having more in-depth conversations. But I'd start doing that sort of around the 10 to 12 age, and then 13, full stop, tell them no.
Full stop. Okay,
Full
got it. And then you talked a little bit about the THC versus CBD, and I was looking at some research studies actually just in preparation for this. And there's some studies that would argue that use of CBD for kids on the spectrum is better than taking medication. And I was just curious your thoughts on one, if you'd ever seen any of those studies and what you think about them.
So there's definitely studies that have shown utility of particularly CBD in neurologic disorders. The big one would be seizures, and so it's all a level of risk, right? And I think I'm really happy that people are doing and they are doing some randomized controlled trials in kids with neurodevelopmental disorders to see whether it can be effective. Of course, that is a highly controlled, very CBD focused, so very unlikely to have the THC component of it. And it's a liquid, it's not an inhaled thing. So I'm, if your doctor is prescribing it for your child, I think that's the person to go with. I would have no problem in looking at a study and saying, I have got a kid who's having 200 seizures a day, 100% try it out. Like this is, that's sort of a no-brainer for me.
Totally. Great.
Yeah, and there's incredible research being done, particularly I believe at NYU, that's working on this. And I've heard of stories of kids who have nonstop seizures in many ways, and it's helped. So medical marijuana has a definite benefits. Just everything should be under a doctor's supervision and to be monitored versus just sort of trying to play doctor yourself based on Google.
Absolutely. I hope that answers the subscriber question because that was one that I took from someone who couldn't be on camera. But Dr. Z, I'm tossing it back to you. Thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. I think that some of these issues are going to end up we're going to end up with some answers to these as the years go by, hopefully sooner than later, because my big concern is that are we going to look back in about 5 years from now and say, oh, I wish we had this information before, and then we have kids with problems. And I do believe that some of the imaging technology, some of the psychomotor, psychological testing that's done will help us understand this a little bit more. So I hope that your research continues and you get the funding that you need, because I believe that you're going to bring some of those answers to the table, which will help all of us. I don't want to end up where we go down the same path of tobacco smoke, where the science tells us this is dangerous, and then it takes us decades for people to sort of change their social behavior to match that. But I do want to thank you for coming on to talk about this issue, because it is so important. And I noticed it in New York City, particularly. You walk down the street, it's unbelievable. And sometimes I turn around looking like, who is that? Who was it? Who came by? And it's a whiff, like a real whiff.
Well, the scary one is when the cars go by.
Yes.
That happens in Rochester all the time. I mean, a car goes by me and it's just like full on in the face. Like they can't be not impaired.
And that's where I was saying that now they're driving a car, and reflexes are so important when you're on a highway. And what are you going to do? What if you have two kids in the backseat of your car and you're driving down the highway and you're smoking marijuana? So that's why I was wondering, what is going to happen? Are we going to be able to find a test that we can monitor them quickly so that we know if someone is mildly impaired or significantly impaired when driving? But thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been wonderful discussion. There's so many different areas of concern here. I'm going to probably have you come back at some point and in a couple of weeks talk about this more. And if I get up to Rochester, I'll come by and visit because your research is fascinating. That would be really amazing to see what's going on there and the research. That is it for our show today. Remember, if you are a Docology subscriber, you can join the conversation. Sign up for email reminders about upcoming episodes. You can do that at docology.life or on Substack. But don't forget to click like and subscribe, and tune in next time, because the topic we cover may just save your life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Docology is a production of Hang Media. Our producer is Catherine Warren. Ronnie Selig is editorial advisor. Our creative director is Anna Richard. Janine Wilson of Wilson Media Group handles paid marketing. Our publicists are Leslie Ann Wade and Jerry Caracoli. Theme music was composed by Nick Kitts. Subscribe and join our community at docology.life. Until next time, move, wash your hands, and stay healthy.